Okay. So to start, I want to talk about Copland's life. Um, but I'm just gonna run through it really. Uh, it's just going to be an overview. But Copland, um, as we know, he was born in New York in the 1900s, and then he studied piano with different teachers and instructors. Um, his sister, and then a professional teacher, and then he moved to take composition lessons in New York and Manhattan with Goldmark. And then at age 21, he moves to Paris, and then he decides to go to Fontainebleau, which was an American conservatory of music that had started so that people who were serving in the army could receive better music education, and they could play um, patriotic tunes better, and also start composing better music. So Copland moves there after the first recital where he performs "The Cat and the Mouse." He gains attention of Durand, who was a publisher, and also of um, Nadia Boulanger, who becomes his teacher. She gets him a commission by Serge Kuzovitsky, and then he brings his first symphony, which was a symphony for organ played by Nadia Boulanger. So they came and introduced that piece to America. He starts using um, jazz sounds, and he had been writing more serialist. The influence that he had in France was of a more modern sound, including serialist techniques. But as soon as he landed in America, he started using popular sounds, and he tried to develop the American sound. So, as I was saying, he used jazz for that, but he also started his second period, his third period, if you will, and he starts composing using more country sounds. So he starts writing more Americana tunes, using and quoting folk tunes that, in his words, he would never use just a tune just to use it, but he would compose it and give it his own interpretation so that it doesn't really sound as a folk tune. He develops important friendships with people like Leonard Bernstein, um, and he commissions some pieces that are performed in the New York Philharmonic. It's really interesting, their relationship, because Copeland, um, there's a lot of concerts in his honor at the New York Phil for his 60th, 70th, 80th birthday, and 85th. So they had a good relationship. But we get to a point where Copland travels around. He travels to Mexico in the 1940s. He goes there many times, starts having good relationships with composers in Mexico, for example, Revueltas, who inspired him. His sounds inspired him to write El Salón Mexico, as it is the place who inspired him as well. He travels then in 1960 to Russia to uh, with Foss, and they present American music there. He presents his Symphony Number 3, and also his piano quintet that he plays with the Borodin String Quartet, and he adds himself as a piano player. So after this, in 1960, he starts writing and finishes Nonet, which is a nonet for three cellos, three violas, and three violins. And I think, and this is what I propose, is that due to his travel to Russia, he comes back to America and decides to change, or starts experimenting with a different sound, which is a more serialist, a more modern, and more formal sound. In a second, we are going to hear an interview where he is talking to Shostakovich, and it just proves that they had a good relationship with a bunch of Russian composers. Yeah, so just Mexico influenced him
Mr. Shostakovich,
to write more rhythmically.
you know that
and here's the interview.
we hear in our country a great deal of jazz. What about jazz in the Soviet Union, and how do you feel about its possible symphonic use?
К симфоническим произведениям.
That Aaron Copland himself produced quite a shock 32 years ago here when he played his celebrated so-called jazz concerto with the Boston Symphony Orchestra.
I have a favorable attitude to good American jazz. Now, what is the meaning of good American jazz? Good jazz is the kind of jazz which executes well good music. As said, as has been said, Aaron Copland, our prominent American colleague, has felt jazz influences, having written a jazz concerto. Also, there is the prominent opera of Gershwin, a genius of an American composer who wrote Porgy and Bess. This also shows jazz influence. It seems to me that good jazz music will continue to exert influence on the creativeness of American composers and Soviet composers and on the composers of other countries as well.
Thank you, Mr. Shostakovich.
So honestly, from my point of view, this interview was very set up. That's how it feels. And throughout the entire interview, we see Kabalevsky, other prominent composers from Russia, just talking about American music, how they loved American and knew American music. But in reality is that the Russians were not as excited with American music as we will see about right now. So in April 1960, Aaron and Lucas Foss spent 4 weeks in the Soviet Union. They traveled there to be cultural and musical ambassadors. Copland was an obvious choice because he had been already a cultural ambassador for Mexico in the 40s. But Foss, even Copland, was confused about Foss's coming to Russia, to Soviet Union with him. But the other interesting aspect of all of this is that even though Copland had been accused of communism in 1953 by Joseph McCarty, Copland's interest in Soviet music was evident. And that is why he is sent, and that's why he wants to go to the Soviet Union, even though he was accused. He was even interviewed by the Congress about this relationship that he had with communist / Soviet Union composers. And he expressed interest in linking the New York Composers Collective with the Union of Soviet Composers also. He admired the socially progressive stance of select Soviet composers. Copland published in New York, in the New York Herald Tribune, an important Cold War document that has received little scholarly attention. And that's one of the documents I read, and I found it really interesting. So if you want to read this, you can pause the video and read it. But it basically shows Copland writing about his experience. He wrote 2 different reports, one to Homeland Security or the government of America, and the other one he wrote was for the New York Times. And so I was not able to find the report he wrote for the government, but this is the one that he wrote for the New York Times. And so he also kept a diary. It was a minimal diary. I think it was just for him to remember, and he wrote down also names of pieces and names of composers that I think he would like to keep reading or keep studying about or meet again. But these are entries that I found awesome, and they just show Copland's world well. So the first one is Soviet composers, if left to their own devices, would love to experiment, because a real artist always likes to try out new things and test his wings. An artist is a daredevil, and there are real artists in Russia, but they are acting country-wise because they belong not just to a country, but to an ideology. I'm sorry. And so I think Copland found himself free to write anything he wanted to write. And I think this visit to the Soviet Union was 4 weeks. And throughout the diary, he writes about how music was boring because it all sounded the same. And that's why my thesis is that he came back to America and he started writing differently. He didn't want to sound still American, but he just wanted to sound like Copland. And so the second entry says Arvo Part, Estonian and still a student, at 23 shows considerable natural gift in his partita for piano, though the piece doesn't quite add up. So there's many composers that Copland writes about, and I found Arvo Part, and we know that he is a big composer and popular composer. And they met, and Copland heard his music as part of those groups of composers that he was meeting in Russia. The third entry says Andrei Volkonsky's Viola Sonata. It was a big surprise when he told us that his most recent music is inspired by Morton Feldman's Columbia disc. Obviously, he has a strong urge to rebel. Copland, I think, ended with an image in his head of composers in Russia trying to experiment, but because of the Soviet Union pressing down on them, they couldn't experiment. So that's why I think he came back to America and started writing as a serialist, or trying out serialist techniques. And the piece that I want to talk about, Nonet, is part of it. There's an entry that says, "I have a cold." Damn. So I think it just shows that he was still a man, which sometimes I forget that these great composers were still human. The next entry is, "I told him that listening to typical Russian music exclusively, it would be hard for me to imagine all the other existing styles of contemporary music." The next entry is, "In the evening, a service intime chez Shostakovich, his wife and son, Mazime, Kabalevsky, and Kareninov, and their wives were there." And so all of these composers traveled and met with Copland in America, and he interviewed them on national television. Um, about a performance of an opera, he also writes, this is an opera by Shostakovich, and he writes, the kids were charming, the rest utterly conventional. And the next entry is instead one gets a sort of overall cordiality which tells nothing. So basically, what he's telling in his diary is that Russia kept writing the same music over and over again, and that all composers wrote the same music again and again. And he also talks that the people were not receiving new music well. The people just went to concerts, sat down, and they heard the music, but no one said anything in where they were being confrontational about the music. They were just saying, that was great. That was a great piece. We loved it. And that happened over and over again. And that's what bothered Aaron Copland. And I really think after this visit, he appreciated the freedom that people had in America to say what they want and to write what they want. And hence we get to 1960, and then he wrote Nonet. He dedicated this to Nadia Boulanger, and I think this is important because of a device that he uses to open the piece. This is just a recapitulation of his periods. So he goes to a serialist or a modern period when he was in France. Then he comes back to America, starts writing jazz. In 1924, after he writes his piano concerto, he says, I found and I used everything I needed in jazz, so I want to go to a different place. And then he starts writing more Americana sounds, sounds that to me sound more percussive, and it's more dance-like. And so, and then he goes to a serialist, more serious, formal period at the end of his life. And in that transition, there's a few pieces that are interesting to point out, and that is the piano quartet in 1950 that he performed with the Borodin String Quartet in Russia, his third symphony that was performed in every concert in Russia, the clarinet concerto that we talked about in class, and the piece that I'm going to talk about today, which is the Nonet 4-string ensemble. And so one of the things that we're going to see in this piece is he's trying with serialism, but it's not too strict about it. He suggests serialist devices with rows. So we hear rows, but he breaks the repetition as he wants. We see a lot of developmental devices, so a lot of repetition in this piece. Different chords where he omits thirds and fifths. And we have... I wrote 2 contrasting sections, but I think there's more, and I present them at the end. So you can basically this is talking about Copland's new way of writing music, but I'm running out of time, so if you want to read it, you can pause it. And this is the Nonet. The piece is 20 minutes, so you can listen to it if you would like. But Stephen Pleistow, basically, what this broadcaster believes, he was a music critic also. He believes that Copland was trying to be more accepted, and he was using his serialist devices for that. But I honestly think he was just trying to find a different sound to keep growing as a musician. And so the opening of the piece shows how he uses a chaconne like device. And as you know, Nadia Boulanger demanded from all of her students to write a chaconne. And I think this is an interesting way of Copland to visit this. And we can see that this is just a label that I decided that I was going to name these chords. In reality, there's more interpretations, but he omits fifths and omits thirds. So this is the opening of the movement with the cellos. The opening is ambiguous, and we really don't know what key we're in. And because he's omitting the thirds of the chords, which gives you the quality of the chords, so we don't know if it's major or if it's minor. As I mentioned before, he decides to write a piece for Boulanger, and there's a chaconne-like opening, and then the chaconne-like first section. The orchestration is interesting because he starts seeing orchestra as more of colors, not as individual instruments. So you can read the three characteristics of this, but basically he uses the trios independently. So we have the three violins, the three violas, and the three cellos interacting with each other as one instrument, basically like a trio of trios. But sometimes he changes and he gives the melody to one instrument of the trios. So that's the way he orchestrates this piece. We also see diatonicism versus serialism. The second section is a section in A major, and it's completely clear that it's in A major for three measures. And when you see the red bars, that's where he overlaps. And we have C sharp. We have C sharps, and we also have C naturals. So throughout the movement, in this section in particular, he makes it even harder to understand if we are in C major, in A major or in A minor. And I think the answer is that he is in both keys at the same time. Then we go to the next section, which is it's Copland's, what I'm calling Copland's Appalachian sound. The meter suggests folk music 3/8 and also 6/6. And that is used in folk music. We have diatonicism, and we have an extensive use of fourths and fifths that are usual in Copland's Appalachian sound, if you will. So we can see the jumps of fourths and fifths that he uses in turquoise. The next section, we have more of the Appalachian sound, but we have this definitely sounds as Appalachian string because he uses a legato line in the bottom, and the top strings are percussive and are really short notes and repetitive notes. And yeah, we have diatonic sounding piece, diatonic sounding section. And well, yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.